Welcome to Hauntings at Dusk, true ghost stories and fiction UK with me, author Tina Van Tyler. Today's episode is a ghost story written by me called The Man on the Clapham Omnibus. I hope you enjoy it. Late one night on the bus home, Jake is approached by a dishevelled stranger who claims they've met before. But why does the man seem so angry, and what does he want? The Man on the Clapham Omnibus. I haven't seen you on this bus before. Are you new to the area? Jake shuffled his feet uneasily and angled his lean knees away from the man sitting to his left. Oblivious to Jake's discomfort, the man spread his heavy thighs comfortably, nudging the youth's legs over even further. Getting the bus home late from his Thursday shift at the coffee shop meant Jake met his fair share of so-called nutters on the bus. While not exactly a nutter, this man, with his fleshy face, thick neck bulging from the collar of a dingy white shirt, crumpled grey suit fraying at the cuffs and the smell of sweat with an undertone of stale booze, had not been welcome when he'd plopped into the seat next to Jake. Especially as Jake knew there were empty seats behind where the man could have taken up as much room as he liked without disturbing any other poor sod. The bus meandered through Clapham's dimly lit streets. With its grassy common and new bells popping up daily, the area was somewhere Jake would love to live if he ever got the kind of job that stretched to the hefty rent required. As it was, he was going home to his downmarket bit of South London several miles away, where so much chewing gum stuck to the pavements you brought a lump indoors with you on your shoe after every journey. Jake felt a dig in his side. The man was gazing at him, wanting an answer to his question. No, I often get this bus home from work. Don't engage with the nutter on the bus, that is the unwritten rule. Give them as little attention as you can get away with and they'll lose interest. But Jake had already given away too much and cursed himself as the man continued. Work? Doing what? You look like an accountant. Can't be much accounting to be done at 11 o'clock at night. The man shook with mirth at his own wit. People often mistook Jake, with his tidy smooth hair and tidy smooth complexion, for a trainee teacher. So this was a change. In fact, he'd failed his law degree at university and got the job at the café to buy himself some time while he thought about what else to do with his life. Despite himself, Jake said, "Actually, I work at a coffee shop close to town." Damn, he'd done it again. Not in Clapham, then. That's where I always get on the bus. In fact, I am the man on the Clapham Omnibus, he chuckled. Don't worry, son. A joke. You're what, 17? Way too young to know what that is. Jake felt exasperated. Why did people think he was a kid? I'm 24 actually, and I do know that term, he said indignantly. It was coined in the 1930s to mean the view of the reasonable man on the street. Only 3 more stops and then I can escape, thought Jake. This guy is probably lonely, so don't be rude. Be kind, Mum always used to say. Be kind to those less fortunate than you. Although Mum was long gone, Dad too. Their death in a car crash before Jake's finals had delivered a nerve-shattering shock, and he'd done so poorly in the exams the university couldn't even bump his marks up to a third-class degree on compassionate grounds. Pressure on Jake's thigh told him the man was pressing his against it firmly. He looked into the ruddy face, but the expression hadn't changed from benign interest. This wasn't a sexual overture, simply a guy who had no sense of personal space. The man spoke again, peering closely at Jake, who drew back in alarm. Actually, I've seen you before, he said slowly, tapping his temple with a forefinger. Give me a sec, it'll come to me. Another bus stop. A woman clutching a fat, panting corgi swept on and sat behind Jake and the man. Jake felt such relief when the name of his stop flashed up on the digital display in front of them. He rose without a word, expecting the man to swing his legs to one side so Jake could pass, the usual bus etiquette. Instead, the man lifted his broad face with its stubbled grey chin towards Jake and grimaced, displaying a gap in his yellow teeth at the side. Yes, something to do with... Excuse me, said Jake. Actually, he wanted to yell, "Shift your bloody legs out of the way, you git!" But he was going to be kind, in remembrance of Mum. The man's jaw continued to work, the cogs in his memory turning slowly as he kept his eyes on Jake. He still didn't move, so Jake pushed roughly past, stamping on the man's foot accidentally on purpose. "You shouldn't do that, son," barked the man. "I reckon you and me have got some unfinished business, if I could just remember what exactly." Pain exploded at the bottom of Jake's spine. The man had thumped him hard. Jake darted to the bus doorway and gripped the pole next to it, knuckles white with rage. The bus doors hissed open and Jake stepped onto the pavement, his breath coming in gasps. He was furious. Yet again he hadn't spoken his mind. Yet again he'd let himself down. Yet again he'd failed. Story of my life, he thought as he hurried down the darkened roads to his flat. His two flatmates were in bed and Jake felt shaken after his encounter with the man on the bus. Of course he didn't recognise Jake unless he'd been to the coffee shop. What could he do to feel better? Making himself a cheese sandwich, he set it by his laptop on his desk. Switching on the machine, he began to pull up photos of Sally, his last girlfriend. Guilt, guilt, guilt. He treated her so badly when all she'd done was love him. He thought back to their last conversation a few months ago. "It's been a year and you still won't let me see your place," Sally had said. "What do you think I'm going to do? Move my stuff in while you're on the loo?" Jake had lowered his eyes. "I have to take things slowly. Getting close is hard for me." "And keeping this distant is hard for me," she said. "I get that you're scared of being hurt since you lost your parents, but I have no plans to leave. You can trust me." "That's exactly what someone who couldn't be trusted would say," he'd muttered. It had descended into a row and they'd lain back to back that night at Sally's. Lying awake, Jake made a decision. "The truth is," he said next morning while Sally pulled on her jeans, "I've met someone else. One of my managers at work. We'd been seeing each other for a while. Sorry." He found his jacket and made for the door. "Sorry? Is that it, after a year? How could you be so callous? Leading me on, lying. Just go." She flopped down on the bed on her back and began to weep silently, tears running down the sides of her face onto the pillow. "You're not who I thought you were." Hiding his own misery, Jake let himself out. Yes, he was a liar. He wasn't seeing his boss or anyone else, but he couldn't take any more pressure from Sally. He needed to sort his emotions out before he could become seriously involved with someone. That hadn't been kind of him at all, but he was too mixed up to be all sensitive new man about it. She'd get over him anyway, soon enough. A fortnight later, Angie, his uni mate who'd introduced him to Sally, called him. "What have you done?" she yelled down the phone. "You've broken that girl. She can't stop crying and won't get out of bed, won't go to work, and I can't get her to eat. Why didn't you at least end it with Sally before you started shagging around? You know she's vulnerable, having lost her mum. You're just a—" Jake didn't reply, stabbing the line dead and blocking Angie's number. He didn't need this, an attack from his friend. She'd been his only pal in London. Without her, and especially without Sally, he felt very lonely indeed. The last he'd heard from Angie was an email 2 months on. "I hope you're proud of yourself," she'd written. "Sally has had a total mental breakdown and is in a psychiatric hospital. She won't speak to anyone, not even her dad." Jake hadn't read any further and had deleted the email. One of the things that had drawn him and Sally together was that they'd both lost close family, although to Jake she was very fortunate to still have her dad. Her old man had problems, had been struggling with life since his wife's death and taken to drink, but he had doted on his only daughter and was always FaceTiming to see how his precious Sally was, although Jake would always duck away from the screen when her dad called and had just about managed not to be introduced to him. But what could Jake do? To him it seemed far better for both of them if they parted. Jake had planned to look at some of the photos from when he and Sally were happy. Fool, he thought. You think that will help? Shoulders drooping, he clicked the folder shut and began an online job search instead. Going over old relationship ground would most likely drag him even further down, reminding him what he'd thrown away. A month passed in a flurry of work shifts and rows with his flatmates over stolen food, and Jake forgot all about the man. The autumn rain was falling heavily, and Jake was grateful to leave it behind and hop on the warm bus after another late shift. The bottom deck was empty, so he headed for his favourite seat, second from the front behind the space for prams and wheelchairs, thankful the late hour meant the area was free from screaming children. Ahead was the screen that showed every area of the bus in turn, changing views every few seconds like an eye blinking. As Jake watched, there was the front of the top deck, where a teal-haired woman stared hard at her phone. Blink. 2 teenage boys play fought on the upstairs back seat. Blink. There was Jake on the screen. After 8 hours serving entitled, belligerent customers, he looked wan and tired, his face as ashen as his light hair. Sighing, he dug out the free newspaper one of the bus's occupants had stuffed down the side of the seat. He'd spread it wide to read when suddenly there was the tatty man from a few weeks ago, lurching through the doors after a guy in a hoodie and making his way towards Jake. The man plonked himself down. He wore the same crumpled grey suit, his chin still bristling with stubble, and again he reeked of sweat and stale booze. "I was hoping I'd run into you," he murmured, as though he and Jake had known each other for years and he hadn't punched Jake that Thursday. With a tight smile, Jake shifted further against the bus wall, hoping to give the man enough room to keep them from touching. Instead, the man took all the space offered and pressed himself once again to Jake's side, arm to arm, thigh to thigh. "Like I said before, we have unfinished business." As he spoke, Jake noticed with alarm that the thigh pressed to his was cold as meat on a butcher's slab, fresh from the fridge. He could feel the chill even through his overcoat. The same went for the plump arm squashed against his. He looked closer at the man. Rather than the red apple cheeks of before, the face was pallid and puffy. And as if the whiff of body odour and booze wasn't offensive enough, beneath it was something else, another smell that made Jake's nose wrinkle with disgust, but he couldn't put his finger on it. "We have someone in common, you and I," the man was saying. "No, we don't," thought Jake. "You're pissed and I'm knackered." He tuned the man's words out and turned to look through the window at the wet streets, the raindrops running down the glass making it more difficult to get his bearings. It was so dark tonight. Ah, was that the post office? Just 5 more stops then. The man was speaking, and as Jake turned back from the window, his eyes alighted on the TV screen in front of him with its rolling display of scenes from the bus. Blink. Downstairs at the back, hoodie guy munched on a burger, the meat and pickle smell sharp on the air. Blink. The bus driver, glancing at his wing mirror and running one hand over his bald scalp before returning it to the steering wheel. Blink. Jake in his navy coat, pale and jaded as always. The seat next to him was empty, the blue patterned back clearly visible by his shoulder. What? Blink. The camera had moved to the top deck, but Jake felt his pulse quicken, his heart fluttering in his chest like a bird trapped in a hedge. Beside him, the frosty pressure from the man's body seemed to seep into Jake's bones, chilling him to the marrow. The man talked on, but Jake couldn't focus on his words. The bus slithered to a halt. The teenagers clattered down the steps and leapt off, the blue-haired woman close behind them. Hoodie guy passed them and left the bus. Now it was just him and the man travelling in the vehicle. Jake's brain raced as he tried to make sense of his predicament. There was, apparently, no one next to him on the seat, yet Jake could see the man, feel his voice reverberating through his bulky frame and vibrating against Jake's upper arm. Squinting to look at the passing shops, Jake noted he had just 2 stops to go. He'd get off early and walk the rest of the way. Feeling marginally better now he had a plan, Jake tensed his feet and knees and began to rise from his seat. At that moment the bus gave a lurch, throwing him off balance and back into his seat as it came to an abrupt stop. Then the lights snapped out, plunging the bus into darkness. Up until that point, Jake hadn't been aware of the sound of the bus's engine, the throb and whoosh as it travelled along the roads, and the idling sound as it waited for passengers to alight and depart. But as the engine cut out, silence fell over the bus like a shroud. The driver will make an announcement any second, Jake thought wildly. Not only did none come, but the front of the bus was so quiet it was as though the driver had dematerialised. Jake made to tense his legs again, planning to jump up and escape the bus any way he could. But the connection between his brain and leg muscles could have been severed for all the effect that had. He couldn't move his arms either, his hands stiff and immobile in his lap on top of the crumpled newspaper. They must have stopped in a street. Jake knew the bus route, yet where were the street lights? The houses with their lighted front windows? The cars, headlamps brightening the road? The blackness was so total they could have been buried underground. To his left, a cloud of frosty air enveloped his ear, and he realised the man had bent his lips close. "This is nice," he whispered. "Intimate. We can have a proper chat now about our shared situation." To Jake's horror, a damp, cold hand enclosed one of his and squeezed it, and, as it did so, a stench of wet earth and rotten flesh rose to meet his nostrils. The man's bass note he hadn't been able to identify earlier. "You know someone who's special to me," breathed the man, "who was special to you, and you're going to pay for what you've done." Icy hands fumbled for Jake's thin neck, encircled it and began to squeeze. A scream stuck in Jake's throat as the hands tightened, and he shut his eyes, clawing at the fat fingers in an attempt to peel them off, rocking and twisting in his seat as he tried to get to his feet. Then the hands were gone, and he found himself standing in the aisle, blinking in the harsh strip lighting of the bus. Jake lurched towards the doorway, his legs barely holding him upright. "Hey, fella," called the bus driver, "are you drunk? Get a hold of that handrail. I'm not opening the doors until you're steady on your feet. I don't want any accidents." "I'm good," spluttered Jake. "Please, just open the doors." He planted his feet firmly, stabilising himself with both hands on the door poles on either side and trying to look like the sober, respectable person he knew himself to be. He didn't dare glance back at his seat. "Only," grunted the driver, "4 weeks ago on a Thursday about this time, there was an accident a few stops up the road, a bad accident. A man stepped off my bus right into the path of a cyclist and was killed outright. It was bloody awful, I can tell you. I had to take time off work, just came back today." The driver opened his own door a crack, stuck his head out and peered at Jake. "Weren't you the guy sitting next to the bloke on the CCTV? You were chatting to him. Wasn't a mate of yours, was he? Old guy in a grey suit." "I don't remember," stammered Jake. "Let me out, please." The doors rattled apart and he almost fell down the bus step to the pavement. Behind him, the doors closed with a clatter. Through the window, Jake eyeballed the seat he'd vacated. It was empty. Rucksack bouncing on his back, Jake didn't stop running until he reached his front door. Empty pizza boxes in the kitchen and 2 wide-open bedroom doors told him his flatmates, both nurses, had nipped home for food and gone to their night shifts. That at least meant Jake could lock the front door, which he did, sliding the bolts home at the top and bottom, although he wasn't sure why he felt compelled to do so. He was home and safe, but he didn't feel good. Something nibbled at the edge of his mind, and he had to tackle it. With a sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach, Jake flew into his room and fired up his laptop. He and Sally had exchanged family pictures one night, and he'd saved hers. Clicking around the screen frantically, he tried folder after folder, vowing to label his photos properly. Ah, here it was. Sally as a girl leading her pony, with glossy auburn pigtails and that wide smile she'd grown into, the large teeth now perfectly in proportion to her heart-shaped face. Sally as a teenager, with her mum and dad, 3 smart, slender people leaning on a silver BMW and looking like they had the world at their feet. And here was Sally at her graduation a couple of years ago, nestling against a man with an arm around her shoulders. Jake clicked to enlarge the snap and his stomach shook. It was the same man from the earlier family photo, but instead of looking slim and healthy, he looked 20 years older than in the first picture, even though it was only a decade on. The ruddy-cheeked face, stubbled chin, sausage fingers and crumpled grey suit were sadly familiar. When Jake heard heavy steps tramp slowly up the stairs minutes later, he knew who it was. Thanks for listening to Hauntings at Dusk. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. Join me again in 2 weeks for another shiver-inducing supernatural story. New episodes on the first and third Friday of every month.